Hello, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. What does Eddie Jones's departure mean for the England squad? Got a bit of a speculative video for you, but I think the fact that Eddie Jones has moved on, the fact Steve Borthwick seems to be the RFU's favourite to come in, does throw up some interesting decisions in terms of selection. So I'm going to get into that in this video. Hopefully you find it interesting as well and it gets a bit of a discussion going in the comments. So do leave your opinion down below. If you're new here, I'll be really appreciative if you want to subscribe to the channel. It would massively help. And don't forget, give the video that thumbs up. All right, let's get into it. So as I mentioned in the intro, it is a bit more of a speculative video, this one, but I do think that it's quite interesting. If we think about Eddie Jones's departure and we think about Steve Borthwick coming in, selection has been one of the major points of contention for a lot of fans towards Eddie Jones towards the end of his tenure over the last couple of years, picking guys out of position, not favouring other people in form in the Premiership. So what could the England squad look like going forward now that Eddie's gone and it looks like Steve Borthwick is coming in? And for me, one of the most fascinating parts of this, I'm going to go through different positions that I think is interesting, but in particular, fly half. Could this open the door for George Ford to return to the England fold? If we look back over the last 18 months or so, Eddie Jones stopped selecting George Ford and he brought in Marcus Smith. And he seemed to be pretty committed to the Marcus Smith, Owen Farrell axis at 10 and 12 to take England through into the World Cup next year. Now, in my opinion, the jury is still out on whether that works or not. I know a lot of people have been quite frustrated already. I think the jury's still out because actually we haven't seen Marcus Smith and Owen Farrell play too much together. But the reason I think George Ford could be back in is he very recently was at Leicester. He left Leicester at the end of last year where Steve Borthwick has been his director of rugby, and George Ford was absolutely pivotal for Leicester's run to that Premiership title. Look at how Leicester have started this season without George Ford, and it's not always down to one player, I get all that, but he is an incredibly intelligent rugby mind when it comes to pulling the strings in that attacking system. I know they lost Ellis Genge as well, and there's been some others players come and go, but I think George Ford has been a huge loss for Leicester. I think he is a guy that Steve Borthwick will maybe rely upon to run his attack again for England. And also, you think about the best England have played over the last 7 years under Eddie Jones, and it was with George Ford at 10 and Owen Farrell at 12. Now, maybe it would be a foolish move to go back in time and go back to that dynamic, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think there is every chance that if George Ford can play his way back to fitness, we haven't seen him play once for Sale Sharks because he's been nursing that injury that he actually picked up early on in the Premiership final. But he's due to come back this month, I believe. So if he can get a little bit of run of form, could we see George Ford part of that England setup in time for the Six Nations? Could we see that as the attacking axis, George Ford and Owen Farrell, if it is Steve Borthwick coming in? To me, makes a lot of sense, particularly when you consider the relationship the two have from their time at Leicester. And would that mean that Marcus Smith is then the guy coming off the bench once the game breaks up a bit, injecting a bit of pace into the attack? Possibly. We'll wait and see, but I think that is something that is going to be very, very interesting to keep an eye on. Scrum half is the other position. If we keep a look at the halfback for the time being, Ben Youngs has still been the guy in Eddie Jones's system, despite the fact that many of the fans think it's time for him to probably move on. I probably would agree with that, but I don't think that's going to be the case now that Steve Borthwick is coming in. Ben Youngs has still been the guy at Leicester. It's been Jack Van Portfleet underneath him. I would imagine we will continue to see that axis with England. Steve Borthwick knows those guys. He trusts those guys. So Northampton fans and all the Premiership fans that want to see Mitchell get more of a chance, can Rafi Quirk make his way in there? Harry Randall is another one. I think there's a good chance that it's still going to be Ben Youngs and Jack Van Portfleet moving forward if Steve Borthwick is the man to come in, particularly as well, depending on how many of the backroom staff Steve Borthwick brings with him from Leicester. Is he going to try and bring Richard Wigglesworth with him as well? Again, those guys have all worked together so much. One to keep an eye on for sure. An area also in terms of selection and what might happen moving forward for England is the scrum, because I don't think England have had a consistently solid scrum over the last few years, really. I know they did a job on Ireland at Twickenham in the Six Nations, but I think if you listen to any of the Irish press conferences after that game, they felt that was perhaps more down to the officiating rather than England actually having the ascendancy in the way that the officials saw the game on that day. It could also be more to do with coaching. I know Matt Proudfoot has come under the microscope a little bit for criticism of not having a particularly good impact on that English scrum over the last couple of years, over the last 3 years or so. So maybe it's also to do with the coaching team. Could it be to do with personnel as well, though? It's such a key weapon if England do want to build into that Six Nations and to the World Cup if we want to look a little bit further afield. What do they do there? Is it a personnel issue? I think Ellis Genge has that shirt locked down. Kyle Sinclair probably does as well, but there maybe are better scrummaging options out there. If we look at a Joe Marler, for example, Mako Vunipola in his time with England, he got absolutely pulverised against the Springboks at Twickenham. He's not the first English prop to be on the end of that sort of treatment over the last couple of years. But I wonder what it means in that area of the game. And also another name to chuck in there, I'm not sure we will see Dan Cole back in an England shirt. We haven't seen him since the World Cup final, where he did have a pretty tough day at the office, particularly at the scrum. But week in, week out in the Gallagher Premiership, he's still doing the job for Leicester Tigers. Again, the Steve Borthwick Leicester Tigers connection. I think it is just worth keeping one eye on that potentially at least. But we will wait and see what happens, whether it's selection, whether it's coaching in terms of that front row for that England scrum. The back row, as always with England, is fascinating. I think Tom Curry and Courtney Lawes at 7 and 6, if everyone's fit, are probably the starting guys. I think most people would agree with that. But what do they then do with that number 8 berth? Because I think after the summer tour of Australia, I thought Billy Vunipola did a really great job in Australia, deserved to have that number 1 jersey, but he had a tough autumn, didn't he, I think, in those matches at Twickenham. I don't think he necessarily had that on lockdown. Alex Dombrandt will be coming back into the fold, who does brilliant things for Harlequins. And then what about the likes of Sam Simmons? Zach Mercer, not immediately because he's still playing in France, but he's coming back to the Premiership next season to play for Gloucester. I just wonder what approach Steve Borthwick is going to go for at that number 8 position. He's a similar mould to Eddie Jones in that he quite likes another line-out option at 6, which is why I think we'll continue to see Courtney Lawes there. But at number 8, does he want someone with a bigger body? Obviously, Jasper Wiese has been so successful at Leicester Tigers. He's perhaps a little bit more of an explosive number 8 rather than just being about sheer power. Does that lend itself to a Sam Simmons? Maybe you've got Dombrandt, who has the best of both worlds, or is it that power game of Billy Vunipola? Another interesting selection for us all to keep our eye on. And then just before I finish up, the midfield as well. England's Achilles heel, arguably over the last decade, the reliance upon Manu Tuilagi, who we all know, when he's consistently fit, can be very, very dangerous, but we haven't seen the best of over the last couple of seasons. If it is going to be George Ford and Owen Farrell, as I perhaps suggest, or even if it's Marcus Smith and Owen Farrell, do we continue to see Manu Tuilagi at 13? Does Henry Slade get more of a chance as that different ball carrier, distributor? Joe Marchant's moving abroad eventually to go and play in France as well, so is his time over? Or is it going to be the likes of Dan Kelly, a Guy Porter, again, looking back to those Leicester Tigers connections, players that have kind of been on the fringes of the England squad, have picked up a couple of caps, but will we see them get more of a run out? Ollie Lawrence is a guy I would like to see more regularly. I think he's been really impressive since joining Bath. I know he was good for Worcester before that as well, but I just wonder whether he's also someone that might come in there. Or is it going to be Manu Tuilagi? Is the pull of Manu Tuilagi just too irresistible for the coaches? Steve Borthwick knows what he can do, obviously, from Tuilagi's time at Leicester, but Leicester also were willing to let him leave. They were willing to let him go to Sale Sharks, a rival in the Premiership. So maybe Steve Borthwick, he decided it wasn't worth it in the end, the fitness trials and tribulations of Manu Tuilagi. Also, just finally, my final point on the video, wrapping up now, it's not long before the Rugby World Cup. Now, how much of a priority is that going to be for the new coaching staff? They can't disregard it, but equally I think there will be a bit more of a longer term view here from England making this change. But the RFU will always expect England to do relatively well at a World Cup. The side of the draw they're on as well in France, I think, is favourable. It's not the draw with New Zealand, Ireland, France, and the Springboks. I believe I'm right in saying I need to double check the draw. So if the draw is favourable for England, they could still go deep in that tournament. But because it's a short turnaround, does that favour, guys like Ollie Chesham who've been there a little bit, but Steve Borthwick knows quite well? I don't know. I think it's quite interesting. As I said at the start of the video, it's very, very speculative. But given the fact that all the reports in the newspapers is the discussions are ongoing between the RFU and Leicester Tigers to get Steve Borthwick in, I think it does mean we can start just thinking a little bit about what could that mean for selection in terms of the England squad. Let me know what you think in the comments down below about all these selections, any other names, any other areas of contention that you want to throw in there as well. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.